In the year 1247, in a stone tower overlooking the port city of Genoa, a young apprentice named Marco tends to the ancient craft of mapmaking. As dawn breaks across the Mediterranean, he begins another day in his master's workshop, surrounded by vellum, pigments, and the careful precision that maps demand. Here, in this quiet room filled with the scent of leather and ink, we follow Marco through his peaceful work. Good evening and welcome. I am glad you are here. Our story tonight takes us to Genoa in the 1300s, where Marco moves through the delicate work of cartography with the kind of steady grace that soothes the restless mind. Settle yourself comfortably. Let this story be a soft place to rest. The morning light arrived slowly through the narrow window of the tower workshop, touching Marco's face with a gentle warmth before it reached the long wooden table where he worked. He was 19 years old, with ink-stained fingers and dark hair that always seemed to hold traces of charcoal dust. The lamp beside him had burned through the night, and its tallow scent mingled with the familiar smell of parchment and the leather bindings of reference books that lined the shelves around him. Marco set down the brush he had been holding and stretched his shoulders, feeling the pleasant ache that came from hours of stillness. Outside, the city below was beginning to wake the distant calls of fishermen preparing their boats, the creak of wooden signs swinging in the harbor breeze. But here in the workshop, there was only the soft hum of the tower itself, the way old stone seemed to hold its own quiet peace. He moved toward the table where the morning's primary task waited. His master, a cartographer named Giacomo, had left careful instructions. Complete the coastline of the Venetian territories on a chart that would take 3 more days of work. Marco picked up a fresh quill, testing its point against the side of his thumb, and reached for the small glass bottle of precious indigo ink that Giacomo reserved for the most important borders. The vellum beneath his fingers was smooth and cool, already prepared with the faint grid lines that helped him maintain proportion and accuracy. Marco breathed in the distinctive scent of the calfskin parchment, not unpleasant, but ancient somehow, as though the material itself carried the weight of all the journeys it would represent. His fingers, though young, moved with the practiced certainty of someone who had spent nearly 4 years learning this craft. The work demanded total presence. Each coastline had to be rendered with absolute attention to the master's careful measurements, taken from the logbooks of merchant sailors and the aging charts that previous cartographers had created. Marco found his mind settling into the rhythm of it. The slight pressure of the quill, the way the ink flowed from the feather's tip, the gradual emergence of the coast that he could not see but could understand through numbers and careful calculation. By the time the bells of the cathedral below rang for the middle hours of the morning, Marco had rendered nearly half of the coastline. His back appreciated the opportunity to straighten, and he stood for a moment, looking out the window at the harbor below. Merchant ships rocked gently at their moorings. The morning had warmed considerably, and the sunlight had shifted to strike the opposite side of the tower, casting his workspace into a softer, more diffused illumination. He descended the narrow stone stairs to the workshop's lower chamber, where Giacomo kept supplies, and where a small brazier usually held water for tea. The smell of baked bread drifted up from the streets below, carried through the open stairwell window. Marco found bread and cheese waiting on a cloth-covered shelf provisions that Giacomo's wife had left for him. He ate slowly, still thinking about the coastline, mentally tracing the next section he would draw. The afternoon brought a gentle challenge. Marco climbed back to the workshop and examined the northern section of the chart, where the coastline became more complex, with inlets and small islands that required precise placement. He consulted the measurements Giacomo had annotated in his careful script, then located the corresponding positions on the vellum using the dividers, a pair of precision brass instruments that felt almost alive in his hands. The work became meditative. Time seemed to move differently when the mind was fully engaged in something demanding yet peaceful. Marco hummed occasionally, a plain chant melody he had learned from a monk who visited the workshop months ago. The melody rose and fell with the rhythm of his work, one note accompanying each careful line, each thoughtful pause as he considered his next mark. By the time the afternoon light had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, Marco had completed the complex section. The coastline now flowed across the vellum with a rightness that satisfied something deep in him. He set down his brush and examined the day's work, comparing it mentally to Giacomo's reference notes. Everything aligned. The proportions were accurate. The lines were clean and true. He cleaned his brushes using the small ceramic bowl of water he kept for this purpose, working the remaining pigment out of the bristles with patient, deliberate movements. The water gradually transformed into blue and green clouds, darkening as the ink released into it. This too was a form of care, an acknowledgement that tools deserved respect. When the brushes were clean, he set them bristle up in a clay cup to dry. The tower had grown cooler as evening approached. Marco pulled his worn woolen tunic more closely around him and lit the lamp again, knowing that Giacomo would want to see the day's progress before full darkness arrived. The cartographer had a habit of returning to his workshop in the quiet hours after supper, often working by lamplight to check the work of his apprentices. The candlelight created warm pools of illumination across the vellum, and Marco took a moment to admire what the light revealed: the careful rendering of each coastline, each island, each notation. There was a beauty in precision, he thought. There was something deeply satisfying about lines that matched reality, about maps that would help sailors navigate safely across the sea. Footsteps sounded on the stone stairs, and Giacomo appeared, his older face weathered from decades of studying maps and charts. He was a compact man of 63 years old, with silvered hair and the kind of posture that came from bending over work tables for 40 years. He moved directly to the chart, his eyes scanning the day's work with the quick assessment of someone who could read the quality of work instantaneously. A slight smile touched his weathered face. He said nothing, but placed a warm hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture that carried the weight of satisfaction and acknowledgement. They stood together in the lamplight, looking at the chart, and Marco felt the deep contentment that came from work done well, from the knowledge that another small section of the world had been carefully rendered and made whole. Marco's hand still rested beneath his master's, and in that moment of quiet recognition, something shifted in the workshop, not dramatically, but with the gentle inevitability of a sailing ship catching the right wind. Giacomo released his shoulder and moved to the shelves where he kept his most precious materials, returning with a rolled piece of vellum that he unrolled carefully across the secondary work table. "Tomorrow," Giacomo said, his voice carrying the roughness of age and the warmth of someone who chose his words carefully, "we begin something different." He gestured for Marco to come closer. The vellum showed a partial map coastlines Marco recognized from his studies, but rendered in a style that was distinctly Giacomo's own. The lines were not merely accurate, they seemed to breathe with the knowledge of actual journeys. Marco's breath caught slightly as he recognized what this meant. In his 4 years as an apprentice, he had rendered coastlines, filled in borders, mixed pigments, and prepared vellum. But he had never been invited to work on one of Giacomo's original compositions, the maps that other cartographers sought out, that merchants paid substantial sums to possess. These were the charts that Giacomo signed with his own mark, the ones that bore his reputation. "A merchant from Alexandria," Giacomo continued, tracing a finger along the partially rendered coast of North Africa, "has commissioned a chart of the Eastern Mediterranean. He wants to know the true distance between ports, the seasonal currents, the safe anchorages." The cartographer's fingertip moved slowly from point to point. "This requires work beyond simple copying. This requires understanding." Marco studied the chart, noticing details he had never seen emphasized in the teaching maps. Small annotations that seemed to indicate wind patterns, tiny symbols that might represent underwater hazards, variations in coastline rendering that suggested different types of shoreline. It was a language of precision that went far beyond the mechanical accuracy he had been learning. "You will continue your regular work," Giacomo said, rolling the chart back up with the same care he would have given to something infinitely fragile. "But in the hours after sunset, we will work on this commission together. You will learn why each line exists. You will learn the difference between a map and a true chart." He paused, and his weathered eyes met Marco's directly. "This requires patience. This requires understanding that a map is not merely a representation, it is a responsibility. Sailors will trust their lives to this work." Marco felt the weight of those words settle into him like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that would extend far beyond the moment. He nodded, and Giacomo seemed satisfied. The cartographer placed the rolled vellum carefully into a leather tube and set it aside, then gestured for Marco to prepare the evening's routine tasks, cleaning the workspace, checking the supplies for tomorrow, ensuring that all the tools were in their proper places. As Marco moved through these familiar motions, his mind was already working ahead, trying to understand what Giacomo's map had been communicating. He had been taught to render coastlines accurately, but he had never considered how understanding the actual journey, the wind, the currents, the dangerous shallows would change the way those lines were drawn. It was as though a door had opened to a room he had been standing beside for years without realizing it existed. The evening had turned genuinely cool by the time Marco descended the tower stairs for the final time that day. The harbor below had quieted, the merchant ships settling into their nighttime stillness. He made his way through the narrow streets of Genoa, where lamplight spilled from windows and the smell of supper cooking drifted from open doorways. His lodging was modest, a small room rented from a widow who kept the building scrupulously clean and left bread and cheese on a shelf in the hallway each morning. He climbed to his room, which faced toward the harbor and received the salt-touched breeze that came off the water each evening. The window had a small bench, and Marco sat there as darkness fully settled, looking out at the lights of the ships and the distant stars that were beginning to appear overhead. His fingers, though tired, still held an urge to work. He had brought home a piece of scrap vellum and a pencil, and he found himself sketching, trying to understand what Giacomo's chart had been showing him. The sketches were crude, uncertain. He drew coastlines from memory, then tried to add notations that might indicate currents or dangerous areas. It was rough work, the understanding of someone still learning to think in a new way. But as he worked in the failing light, something began to clarify. The act of trying to render not just what was, but what a sailor needed to know about what was, changed everything. Eventually, the light became too poor to continue, and Marco set aside his practice sketches. He lay in his small bed, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into night, the creak of ships, the occasional footstep in the street below, the wind that carried the scent of salt and possibility. Sleep came gradually, and even in sleep, his mind continued its work, rehearsing lines and calculations, preparing for the new knowledge that tomorrow would bring. The morning arrived with the same gentle progression of light that had marked every other morning in the tower workshop. But to Marco, everything felt subtly transformed. He climbed the stairs with a different anticipation, carrying bread and cheese that he had collected from the widow's shelf. The workshop seemed to welcome him differently. The familiar table, the arranged tools, the shelves of reference materials all seemed to be waiting for something new to begin. Giacomo was already there when Marco arrived, an unusual occurrence. The cartographer was examining a set of charts that had been brought to him by a sailor, actual working charts, worn and annotated by years of use. These were not the precise, carefully rendered maps that Giacomo created. These were functional documents, marked with handwritten notes, stained with sea water and wine, corners folded where they had been referenced 1,000 times. "Look here," Giacomo said, not bothering with morning greetings. He pointed to a section where the coastline had been modified in someone's handwriting, shifting slightly from the original rendering. This sailor found that the coast was not quite where the previous chart indicated, so he drew the correction. His weathered finger traced the added notation. This is how knowledge grows. This is how maps improve. Marco leaned closer, studying the difference between the original rendering and the sailor's correction. It was subtle, perhaps a quarter-inch on the vellum, which might represent several hundred feet of actual coastline. To someone who had not been trained to read maps, it would have been imperceptible. But to Marco, who had spent 4 years learning to see every line as meaningful, the correction was profound. "We do not invent what we do not know," Giacomo continued, his voice settling into the teaching tone that Marco had learned to recognize. "We receive information from those who travel. We render it carefully. We acknowledge when we are uncertain, and we leave room for others to improve upon our work." The old cartographer rolled the working chart up carefully and set it aside. "This is the responsibility I spoke of last night." The morning's task was to prepare the large chart for the merchant from Alexandria. This meant checking all the measurements again, ensuring that the vellum was perfectly prepared, mixing the pigments that would be used. It was work that Marco had done many times before, but the context had changed everything. Now he understood that he was not merely preparing materials, he was assembling the tools for a conversation between himself, his master, and every sailor who would eventually hold this chart and trust their lives to its accuracy. By midday, everything was ready. Giacomo stood at the workspace, studying the prepared vellum with the same careful attention he gave to every element of his craft. He nodded once, a gesture of approval, and then he did something Marco had never seen him do before. He picked up a quill, dipped it into the precious indigo ink, and made the first mark on the new chart. It was a simple line, the beginning of the coastline that would take weeks to complete. But watching Giacomo make that first mark, Marco understood that he was witnessing a profound act. The cartographer was not merely drawing a line. He was beginning a conversation with the sea, with the sailors who would use this chart, with all the knowledge that centuries of travelers had accumulated and passed down. "Your turn," Giacomo said, stepping back from the table slightly. He gestured for Marco to take the quill. "The next section belongs to you, not as copying, not as practice, but as an actual contribution to this work." Marco's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the quill. He had prepared hundreds of marks on vellum over the past 4 years, but this felt different. This felt like the moment when an apprentice became something more, when the learning began to transform into genuine work. He positioned the quill carefully, consulted the measurements one final time, and then made the next mark. The line flowed from the quill with the same precision that all his work required, but it carried something additional now, a sense of purpose that he had not felt before. As he continued, drawing the continuation of Giacomo's opening mark, he felt his master's attention focused entirely on what his hands were doing. There was no judgment in that attention, only a careful assessment of whether the apprentice truly understood what was being asked of him. The morning passed into the afternoon without either of them pausing for a meal. They worked side by side, sometimes taking turns at the chart, sometimes Marco rendering a section, while Giacomo consulted the reference materials and made notations for the next section. The pattern of their work had its own rhythm, a collaboration between someone with decades of knowledge and someone with the fresh eyes of youth, the steady hands of someone just beginning their true career. By the time the afternoon light began its descent toward evening, they had completed nearly a third of the coastline. It was work that would have taken Marco alone several weeks. But working with Giacomo, understanding not just what to draw but why each line mattered, made the process feel like something entirely different, not labor, but a form of conversation rendered in ink and pigment. Giacomo stepped back and examined their progress. His weathered face held an expression that Marco had come to recognize as deep satisfaction, not the brief pleasure of a task completed, but the more profound contentment that came from work that was genuinely good. He placed his hand on Marco's shoulder once again, and this time the gesture carried additional weight. "The merchant will receive an excellent chart," Giacomo said simply, "and you will receive something as well." "What is that, master?" Marco asked, though he thought he already knew. "The knowledge that you are no longer merely learning the craft of cartography," Giacomo replied. "You are beginning to practice it." The old cartographer moved toward the shelves and selected a wooden box from a high shelf, one that Marco had never been permitted to open. Giacomo carried it carefully to the work table and opened it to reveal an array of pigments far more precious than those Marco had been working with, colors from places so distant that their very names seemed to contain mystery. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, brought through 100 trading routes to reach this workshop. Vermilion from the Far East, gold leaf in the thinnest possible sheets. These are for special work, Giacomo explained, his voice carrying the reverence that these materials deserved. For moments when the chart itself demands beauty alongside accuracy, we will use them carefully, only where the rendering requires more than simple precision. He selected a small vial of the lapis lazuli and set it before Marco. Tomorrow, when we continue this work, you will learn how to use these, but tonight you should rest. This kind of understanding is as tiring as the physical work itself. Marco descended the tower stairs as the evening bells were ringing, but instead of heading directly to his lodging, he found himself walking toward the harbor. The waterfront was quieter in the evening, but still alive with the sounds and smells that came from a working port. He stood at the edge of the quay, looking out at the merchant ships and thinking about the chart that was beginning to take form in the workshop above the city. Somewhere across that sea, he thought, a merchant from Alexandria was waiting for information that would help him navigate safely. That merchant did not know who Marco was, had never heard his name, might never know that an apprentice cartographer had contributed to the chart's creation. And yet that did not diminish the significance of the work. If anything, the anonymity made it more profound. The work mattered not because it carried his name, but because it carried truth. The salt breeze touched his face, and Marco realized that he was smiling. He had been granted something today that he had not fully understood. He was seeking the transformation from someone who was learning a craft to someone who was actually practicing it. The difference was subtle but complete. It changed everything about how he understood his place in the world. He turned from the harbor and made his way back through the city streets toward his small room. The widow had left bread and cheese on the shelf, along with a small cup of warmed wine. Marco ate slowly, sitting at his window and looking out toward the harbor one final time before darkness fully settled. Sleep came easily that night, but it was not the blank unconsciousness of simple fatigue. It was a deeper rest, the kind that comes when the mind is satisfied that it is engaged in work of genuine significance. Even in sleep, his hands seemed to remember the position of the quill, the precise pressure needed to render a line that was not merely accurate, but beautiful. The days that followed fell into a new pattern that Marco had never experienced before. In the morning hours, he continued his usual apprentice duties, preparing materials, rendering the teaching charts that kept the workshop functioning, learning the dozens of small technical skills that constituted the foundation of the cartographer's craft. But these tasks had transformed. They were no longer the work of learning. They were the work of a professional maintaining the infrastructure that allowed more significant work to happen. In the afternoon and evening, he worked directly on the Alexandria chart with Giacomo. The old cartographer's teaching became more intense, more demanding. He would point out places where a line needed to be adjusted by the smallest fraction, where the placement of a notation could completely change how a sailor would interpret the chart. Each decision, no matter how minute, carried implications. "This line here," Giacomo said on the third day of their collaboration, indicating a slight curve in a particular section of coastline, "tells a story. Do you see it?" Marco studied the line, and gradually understanding began to crystallize. The curve was not merely a rendering of the actual coastline. It communicated something additional, a warning, perhaps, a place where a sailor needed to be cautious. The line was drawn in a way that subtly emphasized the danger without explicitly stating it. "How did you know to draw it that way?" Marco asked. "I worked with a captain who lost a ship on that coast," Giacomo replied, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Years ago, before you were even born, I asked him to describe exactly what he wished he had known. He told me about the angle of the rocks, the way the current ran there, and the depth of the water that appeared sufficient but was actually dangerous." The cartographer's finger traced the subtle curve. All of that knowledge had to be rendered into a single line. The accuracy of the measurement matters, but the way the line communicates matters equally. This was the real education, Marco understood. Not the mechanical skills of drawing and measuring, but the art of translating lived experience into visual information, allowing other people to benefit from knowledge that had been earned, sometimes at great cost. Nearly 2 weeks into the work, a visitor arrived at the workshop. He was a sea captain named Tommaso, broad-shouldered and weathered by decades of work on the water. He had come to consult with Giacomo about a chart he had commissioned, but when Giacomo explained that Marco was contributing to the Alexandria work, the captain insisted on examining the young apprentice's section of the chart. Marco felt his chest tighten as the captain studied the coastlines he had rendered. But Tommaso's expression gradually shifted from assessment to something warmer, a recognition that the work was competent, genuine. The captain traced several of the lines with his finger and nodded slowly. "This one understands," Tommaso said to Giacomo, but his eyes remained on the chart. "You can see it in the way the line is drawn. There is respect here. Respect for the sea, respect for those who travel on it." The captain turned to Marco directly. "When you render a coastline, do you imagine the ship approaching it?" "I try to," Marco replied carefully. "I try to think about what a sailor would need to know." "Good," Tommaso said. He placed both hands on the chart as though it were something precious. "Too many charts are drawn by people who have never left the shore. Their lines are accurate, but they do not contain wisdom. Your lines contain wisdom. Keep doing this work. It will save lives." After Tommaso departed, Giacomo said very little, but Marco noticed that the cartographer moved through the next hours of work with a particular gentleness, not a reduction of standards, but a kind of care that seemed to acknowledge that something had shifted. The old master knew that Marco had just received validation from someone whose judgment could not be questioned. The apprentice had moved one step further along the path toward becoming a true cartographer. The chart continued to grow, section by section, day by day. The coastline of North Africa emerged from blank vellum, rendered in precise lines that carried within them all the accumulated knowledge of merchants and sailors and previous cartographers. The notations began to fill in places where fresh water could be found, harbors that offered protection from storms, stretches of coast where dangerous rocks made navigation treacherous. And alongside the practical information, beauty began to emerge. Giacomo introduced Marco to the precious pigments in small, careful increments. He showed him how to use the lapis lazuli to emphasize particularly important sections, how to apply gold leaf so subtly that it seemed almost to exist at the corner of vision rather than on the vellum itself. Each enhancement served a purpose. It made the important information visually distinctive, helped the eye navigate the chart, transformed functional accuracy into something that was also lovely to behold. Nearly 4 weeks into the work, as the chart was nearing completion, Giacomo did something Marco had not anticipated. The old cartographer set down his quill and gestured for Marco to come close. He pointed to a particular section of the chart that remained unfinished, a final curve of coastline, just before the work transitioned into open sea. "This belongs to you," Giacomo said. "All of it. I will not contribute. You will render this final section alone from start to completion. And when this chart is delivered to the merchant in Alexandria, your contribution will not be anonymous. I will indicate your name in the notation. You will be credited as a cartographer." Marco felt something shift within him, something that went deeper than pride or satisfaction, though it included both of those feelings. It was the moment when he ceased to be an apprentice and became, officially and publicly, a practicing member of his craft. All the years of preparation, of learning to see coastlines and understand how to render them, came to focus in this single moment. He worked on that final section with a care that exceeded even what he had been bringing to the previous work. He consulted the measurements multiple times, checked them against the reference materials, allowed himself to think deeply about what kind of information a sailor would need to understand this particular coast. He mixed a small amount of the precious lapis lazuli pigment with careful precision. And then, with hands that felt both absolutely still and trembling with significance, he rendered the final curve. When it was complete, Giacomo examined it without speaking for a long moment. Then he made a small notation in his careful script, officially crediting Marco by name as a contributing cartographer. It was a simple thing, a few words in a tiny script on the corner of a chart, but it represented a transformation that could never be reversed. Marco, 19 years old, with ink-stained fingers and dark hair that held traces of charcoal, had moved from learning the craft to practicing it. The chart was complete by dawn of the following day. Giacomo carefully rolled it into its protective leather tube and secured it with leather thongs. The merchant from Alexandria would receive it within a month, transported by ship across the same waters that the chart depicted. Somewhere in that distant city, someone would open the tube and unroll the vellum, trusting that the lines drawn in this tower workshop in Genoa would carry truth and wisdom that would keep his ships and crews safe. Marco stood with his master in the tower workshop as the morning light began to illuminate the now empty work table. The chart was gone, but something remained. Giacomo placed his hand on Marco's shoulder one final time that morning, and without words, communicated an acceptance and a welcoming into the community of those who serve the world through the careful rendering of truth. "What will we work on next, Master?" Marco asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Whatever comes," Giacomo replied, his weathered face showing the kind of contentment that comes from work well done. "And you will help me create it, not as an apprentice, but as a cartographer." Marco moved through the following days in a state of quiet transformation that seemed to extend beyond the workshop itself. The tower, the city, even the harbor below appeared slightly different, not in any physical sense, but in the way that everything seems to shift when one's understanding of one's place in the world has fundamentally changed. He was no longer a student preparing for a profession. He was a practitioner of that profession, and the responsibility of that status settled into him like a well-fitting garment. The morning after the Alexandria chart departed, Giacomo was not in the workshop when Marco arrived. This was unusual enough to create a moment of concern. But before Marco could fully register the oddness, he heard footsteps on the stairs slower than Giacomo's usual pace, more labored. The cartographer appeared in the doorway, and Marco immediately understood that something had shifted. Giacomo, 63 years old, moved with the physical weight of someone carrying more than exhaustion. He reached for the chair near the primary work table and lowered himself into it with a careful deliberation that suggested his body was communicating something important. His weathered face held a pallor that Marco had never seen before. "I did not sleep well," Giacomo said, as though responding to the concern that Marco had not voiced. "The shoulder troubles me. The arm especially." He flexed his right arm, and Marco saw him wince slightly. Age is not always gracious. Some days it reminds you of its presence more forcefully than others. Marco had never thought deeply about his master's age. Giacomo had always existed in the workshop with a kind of timeless quality, always there, always capable, always ready to teach. But now, looking at the old cartographer with fresh eyes, Marco understood that Giacomo was not separate from time. He was moving through it like everyone else, subject to the same wear that affected all living things. "Should you rest?" Marco asked carefully. "I will rest when my hands can no longer hold a quill," Giacomo replied, but there was no harshness in the words. "This is merely a difficult morning. They come sometimes. By afternoon, I will likely be much improved." He gestured toward the work table. "The morning's task is yours. There are charts that need updating, the regular maintenance work. You remember how?" Marco did remember. These were the charts that had belonged to the workshop for years, maps that were consulted regularly by merchants and sea captains. As new information arrived, corrections to coastlines, updated notations about harbors or hazards, the charts needed to be carefully modified to reflect improved knowledge. It was detailed work, requiring precision and care, but it was also deeply familiar. He spent the morning working on these maintenance charts, conscious always of Giacomo's presence in the workshop, the old cartographer resting in his chair but occasionally offering quiet guidance when Marco consulted him about a particular correction. By midday, as Giacomo had predicted, the cartographer seemed to have recovered somewhat. The color returned to his face, and he stood, stretching cautiously, and moved to examine Marco's morning work. "Good," he said simply. "You are beginning to understand that a chart is a living thing. It changes as knowledge changes. This is not failure, this is improvement." He pointed to several of the corrections Marco had made. "These are precise. These show you understand both the technical requirement and the principle behind it." Giacomo paused. "But I am thinking that perhaps today would be a good day for a different kind of work." He led Marco to a storage area in the tower that the young cartographer had rarely entered. Here, carefully preserved in leather tubes and wrapped in cloth, were the oldest charts in the workshop's collection. Some of them, Giacomo explained, dated back nearly a century. They represented the accumulated knowledge of the Genoa workshop across several generations of cartographers. "When I was your age," Giacomo said, his voice carrying the particular quality it took on when he was about to share something important, "I was allowed to study these charts. They taught me things that no living cartographer could have taught me. They showed me how knowledge accumulates, how errors are corrected, how the understanding of the world improves across time." He carefully unrolled one of the oldest charts, revealing a rendering of the Mediterranean coast that was noticeably less detailed and less accurate than the modern charts in the workshop. "This was drawn perhaps 90 years ago," Giacomo continued, "by a cartographer named Benedetto, who was himself well regarded in his time. Look at this section." He indicated a stretch of coast that bore a curious notation, a line drawn in what appeared to be a different hand, a different ink, a different era. This is where Benedetto was wrong. He rendered the coastline in a way that did not match actual geography. A sailor using this chart might have encountered dangers he did not anticipate. "How was it corrected?" Marco asked, studying the modification. Another cartographer, perhaps 30 years later, worked from the logbooks of merchants and sailors who had actually traveled this coast. He made this correction carefully, nodding in the margin that new information had become available. He did not erase Benedetto's work. He respected what Benedetto had accomplished, but he improved upon it with better knowledge. Giacomo pointed to the notation. "See how it is written. Corrected from the testimony of Captain Tommaso Vespucci, year 1217. Even in correction, we acknowledge where knowledge came from." They spent the afternoon examining the ancient charts, and Marco began to understand something that had never been fully explicit in his training. Cartography was not merely a craft practiced by individuals. It was a conversation across time, each cartographer receiving knowledge from predecessors, adding their own understanding, and leaving the improved work for those who came after. It was the most profound form of what it meant to be part of a tradition. Giacomo seemed to grow more tired as the afternoon progressed, but he continued to move through the old charts with a kind of pilgrimage quality, as though revisiting each one was a form of meditation. He pointed out particular innovations, a new way of indicating depth variations, an improved method of rendering mountains and terrain, a notation system that had been particularly clever. "All of these cartographers are dead now," Giacomo said simply, as they examined a chart that bore a signature Marco did not recognize. "Benedetto, Tommaso, the ones who corrected their work and improved, it's all gone, and yet their knowledge remains. Their understanding flows forward into the work we do now, and it will flow forward into the work of cartographers who have not yet been born." He looked directly at Marco. "This is why the work matters, not because it carries our names. Because it carries knowledge, because it helps people find their way home." By the time they finished for the day, both Marco and Giacomo were deeply tired, but it was the particular exhaustion that comes from engaging with ideas and understanding that extend far beyond oneself. They descended the tower stairs together, moving slowly, and Giacomo paused at the bottom to rest, his hand on the stone wall. "Tomorrow," the old cartographer said, "we will return to ordinary work. But I wanted you to understand this today, that you are not merely Marco the cartographer. You are part of a lineage. You are receiving knowledge from those who came before, and you will pass it on to those who come after. This is the greatest privilege of the craft." The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Giacomo's energy seemed to fluctuate. Some mornings he arrived at the workshop with his usual vitality, and other mornings his body reminded him of his age. But regardless of how he felt physically, he continued to work, and he continued to teach. Marco began to understand that his master was intentionally sharing knowledge at an accelerated pace, not urgently, but with the steady deliberation of someone who understands that there is only a certain amount of time available. They worked on new commissions that arrived throughout the month. A merchant wanted a chart updated to include new information about the routes to the Holy Land. A captain required a detailed rendering of the Albanian coast. A wealthy trader commissioned a particularly elaborate chart decorated with illustrations of the towns and harbors that it depicted. Each commission became an opportunity for Giacomo to demonstrate different approaches, different techniques, and different ways of thinking about the fundamental challenge of rendering a three-dimensional world into two dimensions. One afternoon, about a month after the Alexandria chart had been completed, a visitor arrived at the workshop, one of the few people from outside the craft whom Giacomo always welcomed without reservation. She was a widow named Lucrezia, perhaps 60 years old, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She was the wife of a merchant who had died years before, but she had continued his trading business with a competence that had earned her respect throughout Genoa. "I have a commission," Lucrezia announced, settling herself in the chair that Giacomo usually offered to important visitors. "But it is not a typical commission. I need a chart, not for navigation but for memory." Giacomo's weathered face showed interest. "Tell me more." "My husband spent 30 years traveling," Lucrezia explained. "He traveled to ports from Constantinople to Alexandria, from Sicily to the Levanten coast. His entire life was lived on the sea and in harbor cities. When he died, he left me many things: wealth, a business, a house full of memories. But what I wanted most was a way to remember the places he loved." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I want a chart that shows not just the coastlines but the places he visited, rendered in such a way that looking at it would allow me to remember him." Marco watched his master as Lucrezia spoke, and he saw something shift in Giacomo's expression, a recognition of something that extended beyond the technical requirements of the commission. This was not just about rendering geography. This was about creating an object that could hold memory, that could serve as a bridge between the living and the dead. "What do you envision?" Giacomo asked carefully. "I do not know the technical terms," Lucrezia replied, "but I know what I feel. I want the chart to be beautiful. I want it to be accurate. Of course, my husband cares deeply about accuracy, but I want it to also be a work of love. I want someone looking at it to understand that this is not merely a functional map. It is also a tribute to someone who spent his life understanding the sea. For the next hour, Lucrezia shared details about her husband's travels, the places he loved, the ports where he preferred to anchor, the stories he had told about particular stretches of coastline. She brought out a leather journal that contained his own rough sketches of harbors and coastlines, annotations made in his own hand about particular landmarks and difficulties. It was not a formal chart, but it carried a kind of intimate knowledge that could never be replicated by someone who had not actually traveled those waters. When Lucrezia departed, carrying assurances that Giacomo would create something beautiful and meaningful, the workshop fell into a deep quiet. Giacomo did not immediately begin planning the chart. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out toward the harbor, his hands folded before him in a posture of contemplation. "This is the work that reminds me why the craft matters," he said to Marco, though Marco had not asked a question. "A chart created purely for navigation serves a practical purpose. It keeps ships safe. It helps sailors find their way. This is noble work. But occasionally, a commission arrives that asks us to do something more. It asks us to capture something that cannot be measured or rendered with pure accuracy. It asks us to render love." "How do we do that?" Marco asked, genuinely uncertain. "Carefully," Giacomo replied, "with respect. With the understanding that we are creating something that will carry emotion as well as information. The accuracy must still be perfect. We owe that to her husband's memory. But the rendering will be different. The choice of colors will matter. The placement of notations will matter. Even the way we render the coastlines will matter because we are not merely showing what the sea looks like. We are showing what it meant to him." They began the work the following morning. Giacomo spread out the journal that Lucrezia had left, studying her husband's sketches with intense care. Marco watched as his master seemed to inhabit the dead merchant's perspective, trying to understand what had been significant about each place, what had caught his attention, what he had found worth recording. "Here," Giacomo said, pointing to one of the husband's sketches. "He has drawn the lighthouse with particular care. This was important to him. We will render it more distinctly on the chart. We will use color to emphasize it. We will place a notation that acknowledges its significance." He moved to another sketch. "And this harbor, do you see the detail? He loved this place. When we render it, we will render it not just accurately, but with the understanding that this place carried meaning for him." The work on Lucrezia's chart became the primary focus of the workshop for nearly 3 weeks. Every other commission was set aside or delegated to Marco to complete independently. Giacomo poured a concentration into this work that Marco had never witnessed before, not frantic or urgent, but deeply, carefully focused, as though the old cartographer understood that this particular chart was asking him to synthesize everything he had learned across a lifetime of practice. Marco worked alongside his master, rendering sections that Giacomo indicated, but mostly he observed. He watched how Giacomo made decisions about color, how he decided where to place notations, how he balanced the need for perfect technical accuracy with the desire to honor the merchant's memory. It was a form of teaching that went beyond words. Marco was learning by witnessing, by understanding through observation how expertise translated into the creation of something genuinely beautiful. The precious pigments came out again, the lapis lazuli, the vermilion, even some gold leaf that Giacomo used with extraordinary restraint, applying it only in places where the emphasis seemed absolutely necessary. The chart began to emerge not as a mere functional object, but as something that seemed to glow with meaning. Each coastline, each harbor, each notation carried not just information, but a kind of reverence for the places and the man who had traveled them. One afternoon, as they were nearing completion, Giacomo handed Marco the quill and asked him to render one particular stretch of coastline. It was a significant section, not the most important part of the chart, but far from insignificant. It was the kind of work that, a few months earlier, would have been assigned to an apprentice as an exercise. Now it was being asked of Marco as a cartographer. "This coast," Giacomo said, indicating the section with his weathered finger, was particularly meaningful to him. "There is a note in the journal about a storm he weathered here, and the way the coast provided protection. When you render this, think about that. Think about how the coastline itself became a savior. Try to render not just the shape of the coast, but the sense of protection it offers." Marco worked on that section with a care that exceeded even what he had been bringing to the Alexandria chart. He rendered the coastline with perfect technical accuracy, but he also rendered it in a way that seemed to emphasize its protective qualities, the way certain curves might shelter a ship, the way the contours seemed to offer embrace rather than danger. It was still purely accurate rendering, but the accuracy was expressed in a way that honored the meaning the coast had carried for the merchant. When he finished, Giacomo examined the work without speaking for a long moment. Then he simply nodded, a gesture that carried profound acknowledgement. The cartographer did not need to speak. The silence itself was communication. The chart was completed on an autumn morning when the light arrived in the tower workshop with a particular clarity that seemed to emphasize every detail rendered on the vellum. Lucrezia arrived to collect the work, and when she saw it, she actually gasped a sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She stood looking at the chart without speaking for several minutes, tracing the rendering of particular harbors and coastlines with a finger that trembled slightly. "This is perfect," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "This is exactly what I needed. It is not just a chart. It is a way of remembering him. It is a way of understanding that his travels mattered, that the places he loved were real and significant." She looked directly at Giacomo. "You have captured something that I could not have described. You have honored his memory." After Lucrezia departed with the chart carefully rolled in its leather tube, Giacomo seemed to release something that he had been holding throughout the creation of the work. He sat heavily in his chair, and Marco realized that the old cartographer was profoundly exhausted, not just physically tired, but the deeper exhaustion that comes from pouring one's entire being into a creation. "That is the best work I have ever done," Giacomo said simply. "Not the most technically complex, not the most elaborately rendered, but the truest work, the work that did what it was meant to do." He looked at Marco. "Do you understand why?" "Because it carried love," Marco replied, and he saw his master smile. "Yes," Giacomo confirmed. "The best work we do is always ultimately about love. Love for the sea, love for the accuracy of rendering, love for the people who will use what we create, love for those who will come after us and continue the work." The old cartographer closed his eyes. "I think I need to rest now. Would you continue with the maintenance charts this afternoon?" Marco nodded and moved toward the work tables, but he paused as he was arranging the materials he would need. He turned back to look at his master, who seemed to have already drifted into sleep, his weathered face peaceful in the afternoon light. Marco understood, in a way that was not yet fully conscious but was nonetheless real, that something was shifting. Giacomo's energy, which had always seemed inexhaustible, was becoming finite. The old cartographer was passing along knowledge and responsibility with increasing deliberation, as though aware that there was only so much time left to do so. The afternoon passed quietly, with Marco working on the maintenance charts while his master slept. The tower workshop held a particular piece, the gentle sound of Marco's quill moving across vellum, the ambient sounds of the harbor drifting through the window, the smell of leather and ink, and the countless years of cartographic work that seemed embedded in the very stones of the building. Marco found himself working slowly, almost meditatively, his mind moving between the technical requirements of the charts and the larger questions about the craft and its meaning that had been opened up by recent weeks of work. By the time the afternoon light began its descent toward evening, Giacomo woke. He rose slowly from his chair and came to examine the charts that Marco had completed. The assessment was thorough and precise. Giacomo still maintained absolute standards for accuracy and craft, but it was also infused with a kind of gentleness that Marco had not felt from his master before. "These are excellent works," the old cartographer said. "You are becoming a true master of this craft, not just in the technical sense, but in the deeper sense. You understand why we do this. You understand that a chart is a form of conversation across time and space." Giacomo placed his hand on Marco's shoulder. "I think that soon you will no longer need me to guide your work. You have internalized the principles. You understand the responsibility. You are ready to carry this craft forward, to receive knowledge from those who have come before, and to pass it on to those who will come after." Marco felt something shift in him at those words. It was not quite sadness, but it carried that emotional weight. He understood that his master was beginning to acknowledge, in his own careful way, that age was moving toward an ending. The transition was coming, not immediately, perhaps, but the recognition that it was coming seemed to have crystallized in Giacomo's consciousness. "I am grateful," Marco said carefully, aware that simple words seemed inadequate for what he was feeling. "I know," Giacomo replied, "and that gratitude is a gift enough. Now let us close the workshop for the evening. Tomorrow is the feast of Saint Michael, and the city will be celebrating. We should rest and observe the day. The work will be here when we return." They descended the tower stairs together, moving slowly, and emerged into the Genoa evening, where lanterns were beginning to flicker to life throughout the city. The harbor beyond seemed to hold the last light of the day, and Marco understood, in the way that one sometimes grasps important truths, that he was being given a kind of gift, the opportunity to witness his master's wisdom, to receive knowledge that extended far beyond the technical craft of cartography, and to understand that the work he was learning to do would outlive him, would carry forward, would continue to help people find their way across waters and through uncertainty. The feast of St. Michael dawned with the kind of clarity that autumn sometimes offers in Mediterranean cities, the air crisp, but not cold, the light golden and seemingly endless. The streets of Genoa had transformed overnight with preparations for the celebration. Banners hung from windows, and the smell of cooking drifted from every doorway as families prepared special foods for the festival. Marco had not taken a full day away from the workshop in months. His usual routine had become so habitual that stepping outside of it created a kind of disorientation. He walked through the city in the early morning, moving toward the cathedral where a special mass would be celebrated. The streets were already filled with people, merchants closing their stalls, workers setting aside their tools, the entire rhythmic life of the city pausing to acknowledge something larger than daily work. He encountered Giacomo near the cathedral steps. His master was dressed in his best wool tunic, the fabric dark and carefully maintained despite the wear that years of work had created. Giacomo moved slowly toward the cathedral, and Marco fell into step beside him. They did not speak, but the silence between them was companionable, the kind of quiet that existed between two people who had spent enough time together that words became almost unnecessary. The cathedral interior was cool and filled with the scent of incense and candle wax. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting geometric patterns of light and shadow across the stone floor. They found places to stand among the other worshippers, and the Mass began. The familiar Latin words, the ritual gestures that had remained unchanged for centuries. The community of believers gathered in this one space for this one purpose. Marco found his mind wandering slightly, following the patterns of light rather than fully engaging with the liturgy. He noticed how the sun's position in the sky was gradually shifting the patterns of illumination across the floor, how the shadows of the pillars moved like the hands of some vast celestial clock. It was the kind of observation that a cartographer might make, seeing the world in terms of position, angle, the relationship between objects and light. When the Mass concluded, they emerged back into the festival day. Giacomo suggested they walk toward the harbor, and they made their way slowly through streets that were becoming increasingly crowded with celebrants. The waterfront was particularly alive with activity, sailors on shore leave, moving through crowds of merchants and families, the smell of roasted fish mixing with wine and spiced honey cakes. They found a quiet spot near the quay where the activity was less intense, away from the main celebratory crowds. Here, the harbor spread before them in its full complexity, the merchant ships at their moorings, the smaller fishing boats with their nets hanging to dry, the movement and life that characterized a working port. The water itself seemed to hold the light, reflecting it back in fragments that created an almost hypnotic pattern. "I have been thinking," Giacomo said, settling himself carefully on a stone bench that overlooked the harbor, "about the charts we have created together. Not just the recent ones, but all of the work we have done since you truly began practicing the craft." The old cartographer paused, his weathered eyes fixed on the water. "Do you know what strikes me most about that body of work?" "What is that, master?" Marco asked, sitting beside him. "That it is already beginning to have a life of its own," Giacomo replied. "The Alexandria chart is in the hands of a merchant in a city I will never visit. Lucrezia's memorial chart hangs in her home. The maintenance charts we complete are being used by captains and traders throughout the Mediterranean. These charts are helping people navigate. They are serving the purposes they were created for. He turned to look at Marco. And I have almost nothing to do with that service anymore. I created them, yes, but the work belongs to the world now. It belongs to all the people who are using it, trusting it, depending on it. Does that feel strange? Marco asked. It feels like completion, Giacomo replied, in a way that I did not fully understand until recently. When you are young, you believe that your work defines you, that who you are is inseparable from what you create. But as you age, you begin to understand that the work has its own existence. It continues after you. It serves purposes that you could never have imagined when you were creating it. The cartographer was quiet for a moment. This is a profound kind of freedom, I think. To understand that you can release your work, that it does not need you to validate it or maintain it anymore. They sat in silence, watching the harbor activity. A large merchant vessel was being prepared to depart, and they observed the careful choreography of sailors loading the final provisions, checking the rigging, preparing for the journey ahead. Marco wondered if that ship might carry charts that Giacomo had created, if somewhere in the captain's cabin there might be a rolled piece of vellum bearing his master's signature, and the careful rendering of coastlines that had been so painstakingly rendered in the tower workshop. I have been thinking about something else as well, Giacomo continued, about succession. About what happens to the workshop when I can no longer work. He glanced at Marco. I am 63 years old. My father was 66 when he died. My grandfather made it to 72, though his hands became unreliable after 70. The pattern in my family suggests that I may have perhaps 10 years of productive work remaining, perhaps fewer if my body decides to be less cooperative. Marco felt something tighten in his chest at this direct acknowledgement of mortality. It was not that he had not understood on some level that Giacomo was aging. The physical evidence was clear. But hearing his master speak so directly about the span of years remaining seemed to make it suddenly real in a way that abstract knowledge could not. I have made arrangements, Giacomo said. The workshop will belong to you if you choose to accept it. The tools, the reference materials, the network of commissions that I have built over decades. I have notified several important merchants and captains that you will be taking over primary responsibility for their ongoing work. The old cartographer paused. Of course, I will remain as long as I am able, but the succession is arranged. The responsibility is now officially yours. When did you decide this? Marco asked, aware that his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Years ago, Giacomo replied, but I could not act on it until I knew you were ready, and I only became certain of your readiness in the past month when you rendered that section of coast for Lucrezia's chart. In that moment, I understood that you truly understand the craft, that you understand that cartography is not just technical skill, that you understand it is a form of love. They returned to the city as the afternoon began its descent toward evening. The celebration was reaching its height. Musicians were playing in the main square. People were dancing. Wine was flowing freely. It was a day of joy and release, of the community gathered in recognition of something sacred. But Marco moved through it in a kind of daze, his mind occupied with the significance of what his master had told him. The workshop seemed different when they returned to it after sunset. It was the same physical space, the same stone walls, the same familiar arrangement of tools and materials, but it now carried a different meaning. It was not merely the place where Marco worked under Giacomo's guidance. It was the place that would, in the not-distant future, become his responsibility, his charge, his life's work. "Show me," Giacomo said, moving to the primary work table, "what you would do if a new commission arrived tomorrow. A merchant wants a chart of the Levanten coast, and he wants it to incorporate the latest information from several captains who have recently returned from trading voyages. Walk me through how you would approach this work." Marco found himself thinking through the process aloud, how he would organize the information from the captains, how he would prioritize accuracy while also considering the merchant's timeline and budget, how he would balance technical requirements with aesthetic considerations. Giacomo listened without interrupting, and when Marco finished, the old cartographer nodded slowly. "You would do well," he said simply. "Perhaps differently than I would choose to do it, but your approach is sound. You understand the fundamental principles. You understand how to balance competing demands while maintaining integrity." He moved toward the window and looked out at the city below, now settling into evening. "I think the transition is ready to begin." Over the following weeks, the rhythm of the workshop subtly shifted. Giacomo continued to work, but increasingly he stepped into an advisory role rather than a primary creator role. When new commissions arrived, it was Marco who met with the clients, who listened to their requirements, who created the initial plans. Giacomo would review these plans and offer guidance, but the creative direction belonged increasingly to Marco. It was not a sudden transfer of responsibility. Rather, it was a gradual movement, like watching the seasons change, so gradual that one could not pinpoint the exact moment when autumn became winter, but eventually undeniable that the transformation had occurred. Marco found himself making decisions without consulting his master, and when he did consult Giacomo, it was often merely for validation of choices he had already made. One afternoon, as November turned the light in the tower workshop to a particular quality of gold, a visitor arrived who introduced himself as the son of one of Giacomo's oldest clients. He was perhaps 40 years old, weathered from years of sea travel, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He carried with him a rolled piece of vellum that he unrolled on the primary work table with considerable reverence. It was a chart that Giacomo had created perhaps 30 years earlier. It was worn and stained, marked with notations added by multiple hands over the decades. But it was also undeniably beautiful, rendered with a precision and an artistry that spoke to the height of Giacomo's skill in his prime. "My father used this chart for 40 years, the captain said. "He traveled these waters hundreds of times, and this chart never failed him. It kept his ships safe, helped him navigate through storms, guided him to harbors when visibility was poor." He looked directly at Giacomo. "My father died last year, and I inherited both his ships and his greatest treasure, this chart. I have continued to use it, but I am an old man now, and I wanted to commission a new version. An updated chart, but rendered with the same care, the same beauty, the same respect for the craft that your work demonstrates." Giacomo glanced at Marco, and there was a kind of knowing quality in that glance. "My apprentice," the old cartographer said, though Marco was technically a journeyman now, perhaps even approaching master status, will create this chart for you. He will render it with the same care that I rendered the original. He will incorporate all the new information that has become available in recent decades. And I believe you will find that his work honors both the original chart and your father's memory of the waters you both travel. The captain looked at Marco with obvious assessment, and Marco felt the weight of the moment. This was not a test exactly, but it was something close to one. A client who was accustomed to Giacomo's work was being asked to trust his work to someone younger, less established. It was a kind of faith that Marco understood was being offered as a gift. "I will create something worthy of your father's memory," Marco said carefully. "I will be honored to render this chart." When the captain departed, leaving behind the original chart and detailed notes about what updates were required, Giacomo placed his hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture that had become almost familiar over the months they had worked together, but that never lost its significance. "This is the moment," Giacomo said quietly. "This is when you stop being my apprentice and become a true successor. Not in name or title, but in reality. You are carrying forward the work. You are the continuity now." The creation of that new chart consumed Marco's focus for nearly 2 months. It required research, consultation with captains who had recent experience on those waters, careful integration of new information, with the proven accuracy of Giacomo's original rendering. Marco worked with the same intensity that he had brought to the Alexandria chart, but with an additional weight of understanding this chart was both a creation of his own and a continuation of legacy. It was a conversation with his master across decades, an acknowledgement of what Giacomo had created, and a statement of what Marco could create as his own contribution to the ongoing work. Giacomo supervised but did not direct. He made occasional suggestions, but increasingly he seemed to be observing, watching how Marco solved problems, how he made decisions, how he rendered the charts in a style that was recognizably influenced by Giacomo's teaching, but that was also distinctly Marco's own approach. The old cartographer seemed to be satisfied by what he witnessed. The finished chart was extraordinarily technically perfect, but also beautiful in a way that went beyond mere technical accuracy. Marco had incorporated some innovations in notation that made it easier for sailors to extract the information they needed quickly. He had used color in strategic places to emphasize particularly important features. He had rendered the coastlines with such care that they seemed to communicate not just geographical information, but also something of the nature of the waters themselves. When the captain returned to collect the chart, he stood looking at it for a very long time. Then he carefully re-rolled it into its leather tube, and when he looked up, there were tears in his weathered eyes. "This is perfect," he said simply. "This honors my father. This honors the waters we traveled together, and this honors the craft itself." He looked at Marco directly. "You have created something that will be used and trusted just as the original chart was. You have become a true cartographer." After the captain departed, Marco and Giacomo stood in the tower workshop in the late afternoon light. They did not speak for a long time. Then, Giacomo moved to the window and looked out at the harbor below, where ships continued their eternal work of carrying people and goods across waters that had existed unchanged for millennia. "I think," Giacomo said finally, "that my work is complete. Not in the sense that I will stop working as long as my hands can hold a quill, I will work, but the essential work of passing on the craft, of ensuring that it continues and improves, that work is done." The old cartographer turned to look at Marco. "You are ready now. The workshop is yours. The responsibility is yours. And more than that, the joy of this work is yours, the privilege of rendering the world carefully, of helping people find their way, of being part of a lineage that stretches back generations and will stretch forward into a future I will not see." Marco felt something settle within him, not a completion, exactly, but a kind of beginning. He was no longer becoming a cartographer. He was one. The responsibility was real and permanent now, but it was also infused with the kind of peace that comes from understanding one's place in something larger than oneself. "What will you do now?" Marco asked. "I will come to the workshop as long as I am able," Giacomo replied, "but more gradually. I will rest more. I will perhaps spend time teaching the new apprentices that you will hire to assist you. I will still render charts, but not with the urgency of someone who must prove their skill." The old cartographer smiled slightly. "I will perhaps finally do something I have never had time for, to simply observe the harbor and the sea, to watch the ships come and go, to understand the beauty of the work without needing to create it myself." Winter came to Genoa with its particular character: cold winds from the Alps, periodic rain that tested the anchoring of ships in the harbor, a quality of light that turned the stone city into something that seemed carved from pearl. The workshop continued its work, but Marco now carried the full weight and privilege of its operations. He hired an apprentice, a bright boy of 12 who showed promise in rendering and the kind of patience that the craft demanded. He accepted commissions. He consulted with captains and merchants. He managed the intricate details of maintaining the workshop's reputation and ensuring its financial viability. Giacomo came to the workshop perhaps 3 times a week now, moving slowly but with a kind of contentment that suggested the weight of full responsibility had lifted from him. He would sit and watch Marco work, occasionally offering a comment or suggestion, but mostly simply observing. Sometimes he would work on a chart himself, but these were personal projects, now charts he created because he loved the craft, not because he needed to prove his skill or maintain commissions. One particular afternoon in deep winter, when the light outside was gray and the harbor seemed to hold an almost melancholy quality, Giacomo asked Marco to render a chart with him. It was not a commissioned work. It was purely personal, a rendering of the Mediterranean coast as Giacomo had come to understand it across 63 years of life and 60 years of cartographic work. "I want to create one final masterwork," Giacomo explained. "Not for a merchant or a captain, for myself. A chart that represents everything I have learned, everything I have understood about rendering the world carefully." He looked at Marco. "I want you to help me, not as an apprentice but as a colleague, as someone who will understand what I am trying to accomplish." They worked on this chart together for nearly 3 months. It was not rushed work. Some days Giacomo would render only a single section before tiring. Other days he would work with a focus that suggested he was channeling all the energy of his youth. But the chart that emerged was extraordinary, a synthesis of everything that had been learned through decades of careful observation and rendering. Every coastline was rendered with perfect accuracy, but also with a kind of poetry. Every notation carried multiple layers of meaning. The use of color was restrained but perfect, never excessive, always purposeful. The chart seemed to glow with something beyond mere technical achievement. It communicated an understanding of the world that had been earned through a lifetime of careful work. When it was finally complete, in early spring, when the light in the tower workshop had begun to shift back toward warmth, Giacomo examined it without speaking for a very long time. Marco watched his master's weathered face, trying to read what emotions the old cartographer was experiencing. "This is the work," Giacomo said finally, his voice carrying something that seemed almost sacred. "This is what I wanted to create. Everything before this was preparation. Everything after this will be an epilogue." He looked at Marco. "This chart will remain in the workshop. It will belong to you after I am gone. You will take care of it. You will show it to students who are learning the craft. You will understand that it represents the deepest understanding of cartography that I could achieve." "It is beautiful, master," Marco said. "It is true," Giacomo corrected gently. "Truth and beauty are ultimately the same thing when they are expressed through work that matters." Spring arrived in Genoa with a gradualness that seemed to match the rhythm of the workshop itself. The light lengthened almost imperceptibly from day to day. The harbor, which had been subdued through the winter months, began to show increased activity as merchants prepared their ships for the trading season ahead. The city itself seemed to awaken from a kind of hibernation, and with it, the demand for charts increased noticeably. Marco found himself managing multiple commissions simultaneously, a situation that would have been overwhelming a year earlier, but that now felt almost natural. The apprentice he had hired, a boy named Pietro, was becoming increasingly capable. Marco was beginning to understand what Giacomo had experienced all those years, the satisfaction of watching someone younger begin to internalize the principles of the craft, to develop the eye that could see whether a line was truly accurate, to understand that cartography was not merely a technical skill, but a form of seeing. Giacomo came to the workshop less frequently now. The spring weather seemed to revitalize him somewhat, and on days when he did appear, he moved with a little more energy than he had shown through the winter. But Marco noticed that his master seemed to be deliberately stepping away from the work of the workshop. Instead of engaging with the commissions, Giacomo would often simply sit by the window, looking out at the harbor, occasionally making sketches in a small leather-bound journal that he carried with him. One afternoon, as the spring light was reaching its particular clarity, Giacomo asked Marco if they might take a walk together. This was unusual. They had conducted their entire relationship primarily within the confines of the tower workshop. The idea of stepping outside that contained space felt somehow significant. They descended the tower stairs slowly and emerged into the Genoa afternoon. The harbor spread before them with its characteristic activity, and Giacomo led Marco not toward the busy merchant docks, but toward a quieter section of the waterfront where fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings. Here, Away from the main commercial activity, there was a quality of peace that seemed to belong to a different version of the harbor entirely. "I have been thinking about something," Giacomo said as they walked, his pace deliberately unhurried. "About what it means to have spent my entire adult life rendering the world onto vellum, about what I have gained through that work, and perhaps what I have surrendered." They found a place to sit on the stone edge of the quay, looking out at the water. The afternoon was warm, and the smell of salt and fishing nets drifted toward them. Giacomo was quiet for a moment before continuing. "When I was young," the old cartographer said, "I believed that my work was the most important thing in the world. I believed that rendering accurate charts was a noble calling, perhaps the most noble calling available to someone with my skills. I worked with an intensity that left little room for anything else." He paused, his weathered eyes fixed on the water. "And I was right. The work was important. The work mattered. But I did not understand until much later that there were other things that also mattered, other ways of seeing the world, other forms of understanding." "What do you mean, master?" Marco asked gently. "I mean," Giacomo replied, "that I spent 60 years understanding the world through measurement and rendering. I rendered it onto vellum with such precision that I knew it more intimately than I knew any person. I understood the coastlines better than I understood the lives of people around me." The old cartographer turned to look at Marco. "And now, at the end of my life, I am beginning to wonder what I might have understood if I had allowed myself to know the world in other ways as well. If I had not always been looking at it through the lens of creating charts." Marco was not certain how to respond. This seemed like a kind of confession, a vulnerability that Giacomo had not previously shown. He chose his words carefully. "Your work has mattered," Marco said. "The charts you created have helped people navigate safely. They have served purposes that you may never fully understand. They have saved lives." "I know," Giacomo acknowledged, "and that knowledge brings me peace. But peace and full understanding are not always the same thing." He gazed out at the water again. "I think what I am trying to say is that I am grateful for the opportunity to release the work now, to allow you to carry it forward, to allow myself to step back and simply observe without the responsibility of creation." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the fishing boats and the way the afternoon light caught the water. Marco found himself thinking about all the charts that Giacomo had created over his lifetime, thousands of them, perhaps, rendered with absolute care and precision. Each one had gone out into the world, had been used by captains and merchants, had served its purpose, and then moved into the next phase of existence. The work that had been so central to Giacomo's identity had ultimately become separate from him, had taken on its own life beyond his control or influence. "I think," Marco said slowly, "that what you have just described is part of the reason the craft matters. The work becomes separate from us. It continues without us. It serves purposes that we do not fully control or understand. That seems like a form of freedom in a way." Giacomo smiled a genuine smile that seemed to come from deep within him. "You understand better than I did at your age," he said. "Perhaps better than I understand even now. That is good. That is how the craft evolves. Each generation understands something new." They returned to the workshop as the afternoon was shifting toward evening. When they climbed the stone stairs, Pietro was still at work on a maintenance chart, rendering a correction to a coastline with the careful attention that Marco had been teaching him. Giacomo watched the boy work for a moment, and then nodded slowly, as though acknowledging something important. "The work continues," Giacomo said simply. "That is all that matters." The following weeks brought a change that was subtle but profound. Giacomo's visits to the workshop became even less frequent. Marco learned from other sources merchants who encountered his master at the market, the widow who rented him his room that Giacomo was spending increasing amounts of time simply sitting by the harbor, observing the ships and the water, no longer engaged in the constant work that had defined his life. It was as though the old cartographer had consciously released himself from the identity that he had maintained for so long, and was now discovering who he might be when he was not a cartographer. Marco found that he did not feel abandoned by this transition. Instead, he felt a kind of gratitude for it. Giacomo had stepped away at exactly the right moment when his apprentice was ready to carry the work forward, when the workshop was secure, when the responsibility could be fully transferred. It was a gift. Marco understood, this knowing when to release something that you have held for your entire life. The workshop thrived under Marco's full leadership. Commissions increased. His reputation began to spread throughout the Mediterranean trading community as someone who created charts that were not merely accurate, but also beautiful. He began to develop his own distinctive style, slightly different from Giacomo's approach, but clearly influenced by the years of training under his master's guidance. Months passed. Summer arrived with its particular intensity, the heat of the tower workshop, the abundance of light in the mornings and evenings, the bustle of the harbor reaching its peak activity. Marco worked with an energy that seemed to expand to meet the demands. Pietro, his apprentice, was making remarkable progress. The boy had recently completed his first entirely independent chart, and while it required some corrections and refinements, it demonstrated that he was beginning to truly understand the craft rather than merely executing techniques. It was on a morning in midsummer, when the light in the tower workshop had that particular quality of absolute clarity, that a message arrived. It came from the widow who rented Giacomo his room, and it was delivered by a young boy who seemed uncomfortable with the task of bearing news that he clearly sensed was significant. Giacomo, the message explained, had died peacefully in his sleep. The words seemed to arrive from very far away. Marco read them once, then again, as though repetition might alter their meaning. But the words remained unchanged, and their meaning remained absolute. Giacomo, 63 years old with silvered hair and work-reddened hands, was dead. Marco sat down heavily in a chair near the primary work table. He did not weep, though he felt something vast and hollow opening within him. Instead, he found himself looking around the workshop at the tools that Giacomo had used for decades, at the reference charts on the shelves, at the leather-bound journals that contained decades of accumulated knowledge. The physical space seemed suddenly different, as though it had been fundamentally altered by the absence of the person who had inhabited it for so many years. Pietro appeared at the top of the stairs, having sensed that something significant had occurred. "Master," the boy asked hesitantly. "My teacher has died," Marco said, and speaking the words aloud made them seem both more real and somehow impossible. "Giacomo, the cartographer, my master." The boy looked uncertain how to respond. He had never met Giacomo, had only heard stories about the old cartographer from Marco. But he seemed to understand that something important had shifted, that the workshop had been affected by an absence rather than a presence. "What happens now?" Pietro asked quietly. Marco looked at his young apprentice, and in that moment, he understood something that Giacomo had probably understood for years. The work continued. The craft continued. Death was not a cessation of the work, it was merely another transition point, another moment when responsibility passed from one person to the next. Giacomo's death did not end the work. It merely meant that someone else now carried the full weight of maintaining and advancing it. "We continue," Marco said. "We continue the work. That is what we do." He rose from his chair and moved to the work table where several commissions were in various stages of completion. He selected the most urgent one, a chart for a merchant who needed it before his ships departed in 2 weeks. Marco positioned the vellum, selected the appropriate quill, and dipped it into the ink. His hand was steady as he made the first mark. The line flowed onto the vellum with the precision that 40 years of training had embedded into his master, which had been passed on to him through years of careful teaching. The coastline began to emerge, rendered with absolute accuracy, but also with a kind of reverence for the knowledge that had made this rendering possible. Pietro watched from across the workshop, understanding without being told that this moment was significant. The boy understood, perhaps more immediately than Marco himself, that something essential about the work was being affirmed in this continuation. The death of the master did not stop the work. The work itself seemed to exist beyond any individual person, eternal and continuous in its demand for precision and care. The following day, Marco attended the funeral mass. It was held in the cathedral where he and Giacomo had observed the feast of St. Michael. Was it really only 9 months ago? It seemed like both yesterday and a lifetime. The cathedral was less crowded than Marco might have expected. Giacomo had not been a prominent public figure, despite the significance of his work. But there were merchants present, a few captains who had used his charts over the years, other craftspeople from Genoa who recognized a fellow master of their profession. The priest spoke about the importance of the departed soul, the unknown virtues that Giacomo surely possessed, the hope for eternal rest. But Marco found himself thinking instead about the charts that Giacomo had created over his lifetime, all the coastlines rendered with such care, all the notations that had helped people navigate safely across dangerous waters. That was Giacomo's legacy. That was what would outlive him. After the funeral, several merchants and captains approached Marco to express their condolences, but also to assure him that they trusted his work, that they were confident the workshop would continue to produce charts of the highest quality. They were not being merely polite. They were making statements of fact. The work would continue. The responsibility had been transferred. The future of the craft was secure. The weeks and months that followed were strange in a way that Marco had not anticipated. The workshop felt different in Giacomo's absence, but not damaged or diminished. Rather, it felt more fully Marco's own, not in an arrogant or proprietary sense, but in the sense of full responsibility and full ownership. He made decisions about commissions without consulting anyone. He implemented changes to the organization of the workspace. He developed new techniques for rendering certain types of coastlines, innovations that built on what Giacomo had taught him, but that were distinctly Marco's own contributions. Pietro continued to progress in his apprenticeship. By autumn, he was capable of executing entire sections of charts independently, requiring only final review and occasional corrections. Marco began to understand that he might someday have an apprentice of his own who would eventually become a master cartographer, continuing the line of knowledge and skill forward into a future that Marco would never see. One afternoon, as autumn was shifting toward winter, Marco was organizing the materials in the workshop when he discovered something he had not seen before: a small leather-bound book hidden in a nook near the reference shelves. When he opened it, he realized it was Giacomo's personal journal, the one that the old cartographer had sometimes been seen carrying during his final months. The pages were filled with sketches and observations, not formal charts, but personal renderings of the harbor, the city, the faces of people Giacomo encountered. There were notes, written in his careful script, about his thoughts on various commissions, reflections on particular charts he had created, observations about the nature of the work itself. But near the end of the journal, Marco found several pages that seemed to have been written more recently in handwriting that was slightly shakier than the earlier entries, but that carried a kind of intensity that transcended the physical difficulty of rendering the words. I have understood in these final months what it means to step away from the work. For 60 years, I understood myself as a cartographer. My identity, my purpose, my reason for existing seemed to be bound up in the act of rendering the world onto vellum. But now that I have released the work to Marco, I find myself discovering that I am more than the work. I am also simply a person, capable of observing, of feeling, of existing without the burden of constantly creating. Marco will take the craft forward. He will do it well. He will improve upon what I have done, the way I improved upon what those before me had done. This is how knowledge moves forward through time, and I am at peace with this. I have released the work, and in releasing it, I have released something of myself. I do not know what comes after, but I know that the work will continue, and that is enough. If Marco finds this, I want him to know that he was ready long ago, but I did not allow him to see that readiness until I myself could no longer work. This was perhaps selfish on my part, an extension of my own need to feel necessary. But it was also an act of care. He needed to understand the work deeply before he could release it from himself. He needed to know that the work would continue without him. I trust he understands this now. Marco closed the journal carefully and held it for a long moment, conscious of the weight it carried, not physical weight, but the weight of words written by someone who had understood something profound in the final months of his life. He understood, in that moment, that Giacomo had been preparing for his own death and had been consciously stepping away from the work in order to allow Marco to understand that the work existed beyond any individual person. He placed the journal carefully in a secure location, not hidden, but preserved with the kind of care that important documents deserved. It was part of the history of the workshop now, part of the record of how knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The years that followed unfolded with a rhythm that Marco had never quite experienced before, not the urgent rhythm of learning and proving oneself, but the deeper rhythm of practicing a craft with confidence and mastery. He continued to create charts of remarkable beauty and accuracy. His reputation spread throughout the Mediterranean, and commissions arrived from cities as distant as Venice, Alexandria, and Palermo. Pietro eventually completed his apprenticeship and became a journeyman cartographer. Marco hired additional apprentices. The workshop expanded, occupying more of the tower than it had before. And yet, despite the increased activity and the additional people, the essential character of the work remained unchanged. Each chart was rendered with absolute precision. Each coastline was treated with the kind of reverence that Giacomo had taught Marco to bring to the work. By the time Marco was in his 30s, the workshop had become one of the most respected cartographic centers in the Mediterranean. Merchants and captains sought out his charts specifically, willing to pay premium prices for the quality and beauty of the rendering. But Marco understood, as Giacomo had taught him, that the reputation of the workshop was not primarily about Marco himself. It was about the work, about the commitment to accuracy and beauty that the workshop maintained regardless of who was doing the rendering. Years passed. Marco himself aged. His hair, which had been dark, began to show strands of gray. His hands, which had been smooth and supple, became weathered and calloused from decades of holding quills, from the constant contact with vellum and pigments. But his eyes remained sharp, and his commitment to the work never wavered. One particular afternoon, when Marco was perhaps 45 years old, a young man arrived at the workshop seeking apprenticeship. He was perhaps 17, with the kind of quiet intensity that Marco recognized as the mark of someone who had found their calling. Marco accepted him, and over the years that followed, he taught this young man exactly as Giacomo had taught him, not with urgency or harshness, but with the kind of patient precision that seemed to communicate that every mark mattered, that accuracy was sacred, that cartography was a form of love. And Marco understood, as he worked with this new apprentice, that he was becoming something that Giacomo had been when Marco first arrived at the tower workshop. He was the master now, in the fullest sense. He was the person carrying forward the knowledge, maintaining the standards, ensuring that the craft did not diminish or simplify, but instead deepened and evolved with each generation. One evening, as the light was fading and the apprentice had departed for the day, Marco found himself alone in the tower workshop, looking at the chart that Giacomo had created as his final masterwork, the chart that represented everything the old cartographer had learned across a lifetime of careful observation and rendering. The chart had been framed and placed on the wall of the workshop, a kind of shrine to the depth of knowledge and understanding that the craft could achieve. Marco stood before it, and in that moment, he understood what Giacomo had been trying to communicate in those final months of his life. The work was not about any individual person. The work was continuous, flowing forward across generations, each person adding their understanding and then releasing it, allowing the next person to receive it and add their own contribution. The work would continue after Marco, carried forward by the apprentices he was training, by their apprentices, by generations yet unborn. And in understanding this, Marco felt a kind of peace settle into him, the same peace that Giacomo had seemed to achieve in his final months. It was the peace of understanding one's place in something larger than oneself, of recognizing that one's life and work were part of a conversation that stretched backward through generations and would stretch forward into a future that one would never see. He looked out the window at the harbor below, where ships continued their eternal work of carrying people and goods across the sea, guided by charts rendered by people who had never seen those waters, who had trusted in the accuracy of lines drawn on vellum. The work mattered. The work would continue. And that was enough. The seasons turned again, as they always did, with the reliable rhythm that had characterized Marco's entire life. Summer faded into autumn, autumn became winter, and the tower workshop moved through its familiar cycles. The apprentice Marco had taken on his name was Giovanni, proved to be a capable student, progressing through the foundational skills of the craft with steady determination. But it was a different kind of teaching now, Marco realized. He was no longer teaching someone he had chosen to be his successor. He was simply teaching the craft, allowing the work itself to determine who would truly become a master cartographer and who might move on to something else. It was a liberation, Marco understood, to release that particular kind of responsibility, the burden of believing that one's role was to create a specific successor, to pass on the craft to one chosen person. Instead, he was simply maintaining the workshop, accepting apprentices, teaching the principles, and allowing the work itself to be the guide. Some apprentices would stay. Others would eventually move to other crafts or other cities. That was not a failure. That was simply how the world worked. One afternoon in late autumn, when the light in the tower had that particular quality of amber and shadow that seemed to belong to no other season, a visitor arrived at the workshop. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years old, with an air of authority that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously. Her name was Caterina, and she introduced herself as a merchant who had recently returned from trading voyages to both Constantinople and Alexandria. "I have heard much about your workshop," Caterina said, examining the charts that Marco had on display for potential clients. "I have seen charts that you created, and I have also seen charts created by your predecessor, the cartographer Giacomo. I understand he passed into the next life some years ago." "He did," Marco confirmed. "I was trained by him for many years before taking over the workshop. His legacy continues in everything we create here." Caterina nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had suspected. "I have a commission," she said, "but it is unusual. I do not merely want a chart of the routes that ships travel. I want something different, something more personal." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I have spent the last 15 years traveling these trade routes. I have lost both a husband and a brother to the sea. I have also made my fortune, built a business, become someone whom people respect. But all of that happened across waters, in harbors, through connections that span the Mediterranean and beyond." Marco gestured for her to continue. "I want a chart," Caterina said. "That shows not just the geography, but the meaning of the geography. I wanted to show where my husband died. I wanted to show where I first arrived as a young widow trying to establish myself in trade. I wanted to show every port where I have conducted business, every route I have traveled, every connection I have built." She looked directly at Marco. "I want a chart that is, in effect, a map of my own life. But I want it rendered with such accuracy and beauty that it is also a genuine chart that other merchants could use for navigation. Is such a thing possible?" Marco found himself thinking about Lucrezia, the widow who had commissioned the memorial chart from Giacomo years earlier. That chart had been about honoring the past, about holding onto memory. But this commission seemed to be asking for something different, not a memorial to loss, but a celebration of a life that had been lived fully, despite loss. It was a request to create something that honored both the practical reality of the world and the subjective meaning that the world carried for one particular person. "It is possible," Marco said carefully, "but it will require extensive consultation. I will need to understand your journey in detail. I will need to know not just where you have been, but what those places have meant to you. And then I will need to find a way to render all of that onto a chart in such a way that it communicates both absolute geographical accuracy and the emotional truth of your experience." "Can you do this?" Caterina asked. "I believe I can," Marco replied. "I was trained by someone who understood that cartography is ultimately a form of love. He taught me that the most important charts are those that serve purposes beyond mere navigation. If you are willing to work with me, to share your story in detail, I believe we can create something that honors both your journey and the integrity of the craft." Over the following weeks, Caterina visited the workshop regularly. She brought with her journals filled with her own sketches of harbors and coastlines, notes about the cities where she had conducted business, records of the routes she had traveled. But more than the documents, she brought her stories. She told Marco about the merchant she had married, about the harbor where he had been lost in a storm. She told him about her brother, about the young widow she had been when she first arrived in Alexandria to discover that she was alone in the world but also suddenly free to determine her own future. Marco listened and sketched as she spoke. He created preliminary renderings based on her descriptions, then brought them back for her to review and correct. Gradually, through this process of dialogue and revision, a chart began to emerge. It was still geographically accurate. Every coastline was rendered with absolute precision, every harbor positioned correctly according to the measurements that Marco had consulted from reference materials. But the chart was also infused with something else. It communicated the emotional journey that had unfolded across these geographical spaces. Caterina's lost husband was commemorated not with an explicit notation, but through a subtle rendering of the harbor where he died. The lines seemed to communicate both the physical reality of the location and a kind of sorrow that was held within the accuracy of the rendering. Similarly, the port where she had first arrived as a young widow was rendered with such care that it seemed to glow with the significance of that moment, the moment when loss had transformed into possibility. Marco involved Giovanni in parts of the work, showing his apprentice how it was possible to render both accuracy and meaning simultaneously, how precision and emotion could be held together without diminishing either one. Giovanni watched closely, understanding that this was a moment of teaching that went beyond mere technical instruction. This was an opportunity to witness how the craft could serve purposes that extended far beyond simple navigation. The chart consumed several months of work. By the time it was nearing completion, winter had settled into Genoa, and the harbor below had taken on the particular character it held during the cold months. Fewer ships, a kind of hibernation that seemed to grip the entire port. But in the tower workshop, the work continued with undimmed intensity. When Caterina finally came to collect the completed chart, she stood looking at it for an extraordinarily long time. Her face held an expression that Marco had come to recognize in other clients who were viewing completed charts, a moment of recognition, of seeing something that one had only imagined finally rendered into physical form. "This is beautiful," Caterina said finally. Her voice carried an undercurrent of emotion. "This is more beautiful than I dared hope. You have captured not just the places I have been, but the meaning of my journey. You have created something that honors both my husband and my own determination to survive and build something after his death." She turned to look at Marco directly. "You have created a chart that is a form of love." "That is what cartography is," Marco replied. "Or at least, that is what I was taught. The best charts are created out of a form of love for the world, for accuracy, for the people who will use the charts and depend on them. Your chart is a love letter to your own life and to the waters you have traveled." Caterina carefully re-rolled the chart and secured it in its leather tube. But before she departed, she placed her hand on Marco's arm. "I want you to know something," she said. "I have traveled extensively, and I have seen charts created by many cartographers. Some were merely functional. Some were beautiful but not accurate. Only a few have managed to combine absolute accuracy with genuine beauty and meaning. Your workshop is one of those rare places. What you do here matters. What you preserve and pass on matters. Do not ever doubt that." After Caterina departed, Marco stood alone in the tower workshop, looking at the space where her chart had been. He was aware of Giovanni watching from across the workspace, observing his master's response to the client's departure. Marco understood what Giovanni was learning at that moment, that the work mattered, that it was valued, that it served purposes that went far beyond the mere rendering of geographical information. "That," Marco said to Giovanni, "is why we do this work. Not for the payment, though we must receive payment to sustain ourselves, but because the work can carry meaning, because it can honor people's lives and journeys, because it can communicate something true about the world and about human experience." Giovanni nodded slowly, and Marco saw understanding crystallize in his young apprentice's eyes. The boy was beginning to understand that cartography was not merely a technical skill, but a craft that carried genuine responsibility and genuine opportunity for creating meaning. The years continued to unfold. Marco aged further. His hair, which had been partially gray, gradually became entirely silver. His hands became even more weathered, though they never lost their steadiness or their ability to render perfect lines. But more than physical aging, Marco experienced a kind of deepening, a gradual recognition of all the connections between the work he did and the lives of people he would never meet. Ships carrying his charts sailed to ports throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Merchants used his renderings to plan their trading voyages. Captains depended on his accuracy to navigate safely through dangerous waters. And occasionally, visitors would arrive at the workshop bearing charts that Marco had created years earlier, charts that had served their purpose faithfully, and that the owners now wanted to preserve or to have updated. One such visitor arrived on a spring morning when Marco was in his early 50s. The man was perhaps 60 years old, with the bearing of someone who had spent his entire life at sea. He carried with him a chart that Marco recognized immediately. It was one he had created nearly 30 years earlier, when he was just beginning to establish his reputation as a master cartographer. "This chart saved my life," the captain said simply, placing the aged vellum carefully on the work table. "When I was a young man, I purchased this chart to help me navigate safely through a particularly dangerous stretch of water off the Albanian coast. There was a storm that I did not anticipate, and this chart, the way you had rendered the depth variations, the way you had indicated the location of the reefs, this chart allowed me to navigate to safety when I might otherwise have been lost." The captain was quiet for a moment, looking at the chart as though it were something sacred. "I have used this chart for 30 years, he continued. "I have traveled that stretch of water perhaps 200 times, and every time I have thought of the cartographer who rendered this with such precision. I have wondered if you understood that your work had saved lives, and I wanted to tell you directly. Your work matters. The precision you brought to this rendering mattered. It kept me alive." Marco found himself moved in a way he could not fully articulate. He had understood, intellectually, that his work served practical purposes, but hearing directly from someone whose life had been preserved by the accuracy of his rendering was something different entirely. It was a confrontation with the reality that precision mattered, that accuracy was not merely a technical virtue, but a form of care for human life. "I am honored to hear this," Marco said carefully. "When I render a chart, I think about the people who will use it, and I imagine their journey. But I do not always know the outcome of that journey. To learn that my work contributed to your survival, this is a kind of grace." The captain stayed at the workshop for several hours. He told Marco stories about the waters he had navigated, about the dangers he had encountered, about how he had learned to read charts not just as geographical information, but as guidance written in lines and notations by someone who cared about the accuracy and the meaning of what they had created. When he finally departed, he left Marco with a gift, a small wooden box containing a compass that he said had belonged to his father, and that had been used to navigate the same waters that were rendered in Marco's chart. The captain had included a note explaining that he wanted Marco to have it as a token of gratitude for work that had, quite literally, made a difference in the captain's life and the lives of the crew that he had commanded over the decades. Marco placed the compass carefully in a location of honor within the workshop, where both he and Giovanni and all future apprentices could see it. It was a reminder of something that was easy to forget in the daily work of rendering charts, that the work had real consequences, that the precision mattered, that cartography was not an abstract exercise, but a craft that could genuinely impact whether people lived or died, whether they found their way or became lost. That evening, as the light was fading from the tower workshop, Marco found himself thinking about the lineage of knowledge that had brought him to this moment. He thought about Giacomo, who had trained him with such care and precision. He thought about Giacomo's master, whose name Marco did not know, but who had taught Giacomo what Marco was now teaching Giovanni. He thought about all the cartographers who had come before, stretching back through the centuries, each one receiving knowledge from predecessors and passing it forward to successors. And he understood, in a way that he had not fully understood even when Giacomo had explained it to him, that he was not merely an individual cartographer creating individual charts. He was a link in a chain that stretched backward and forward through time. The knowledge he carried, the precision he maintained, the standards he upheld, all of these were not purely his own. They belonged to a tradition that was larger than any individual person. Giovanni appeared at the top of the stairs, having noticed that Marco was still in the workshop, even though the light had nearly faded completely. "Master," the young man said, "should we not be closing the workshop for the evening?" "Yes," Marco replied, rising from where he had been sitting. "We should, but first I want to show you something." Marco led Giovanni to the wall where the chart that Giacomo had created as his final masterwork was still displayed. The old vellum had faded slightly over the decades, but the rendering remained beautiful and precise, testament to the depths of understanding that the old cartographer had achieved across a lifetime of careful work. "This chart," Marco said, "was created by the cartographer who trained me. He created it as a kind of summary of everything he had learned across 60 years of work. When I look at it now, I see not just a rendering of coastlines, but a conversation spanning generations. Giacomo learned from his predecessors. I learned from Giacomo, and you are learning from me." Marco turned to look at his apprentice. "And someday, perhaps you will create a chart like this one, a chart that represents everything you have understood across a lifetime of careful work. That chart will carry forward all the knowledge that was passed to you, plus the new understanding that you will add through your own work and experience." Giovanni gazed at Giacomo's chart with an expression of reverence. "Do you think I will ever reach that level of mastery?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," Marco replied with complete honesty. "That depends on many things, on your dedication, on your willingness to understand that accuracy is sacred, on whether you come to understand that cartography is ultimately a form of love. But I do know that if you commit yourself to the craft with genuine sincerity, you will contribute something valuable to this lineage of knowledge. Whether you reach the level of creating a masterwork like this chart, that is for the future to determine." They descended the tower stairs together, and Marco took a moment before they parted to look back up at the workshop one final time before closing the door. The space was now dark, but he could imagine the work tables, the carefully arranged tools, the reference materials on the shelves, all waiting for tomorrow when the work would resume. The workshop had existed for longer than Marco had been alive. It would continue to exist after him. The work would go on. And that, Marco understood now in a way that he could never have fully grasped in his youth, was both the humbling truth and the most profound source of hope, available to anyone who dedicated themselves to a craft that mattered. The following spring, when the light in the tower workshop had that particular quality of clarity that seemed to belong to no other season, Marco found himself thinking more frequently about time and its passage. The workshop had become a kind of sanctuary to him over the decades, not a place of constant urgency, but a space where the work of rendering the world with precision and care could unfold at its own pace. Giovanni had matured into a capable cartographer. The young man was beginning to make his own decisions about commissions, to develop his own style while still maintaining the standards that Marco had learned from Giacomo and that Marco had worked to preserve. The succession was secure. The work would continue. One particular afternoon, Marco was organizing the reference materials when he came across Giacomo's personal journal again. He had consulted it occasionally over the years, but now he opened it to the pages where his master had written about releasing the work, about understanding that identity could extend beyond the craft itself. The handwriting was shakier than in earlier entries, but the understanding expressed in those final pages seemed to grow only deeper with each reading. Marco understood that he was approaching that same threshold that Giacomo had reached, the moment when one's lifetime of work was complete, when the responsibility could be genuinely released to those who came after. It was not a sad understanding. Rather, it carried a kind of peace, the same peace that Marco had witnessed in his master during those final months. He began to spend more time simply observing the harbor from the tower window. He watched the ships come and go, carrying charts that he and his predecessors had created, guided by the careful rendering of coastlines and the notation of harbors and hazards. Somewhere out on those waters, people were trusting the work that had been rendered in this tower. The thought brought him a deep contentment. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting the harbor in shades of gold and amber, Marco sat at the work table and began to prepare a chart for himself. It was not a commissioned work. It was a personal rendering, just as Giacomo's final masterwork had been personal. But where Giacomo's chart had been a synthesis of geographical understanding across a lifetime, Marco's chart was something different. It was a rendering of his own journey, not in the sense of places he had traveled, but in the sense of the people who had shaped him and the work that had consumed his life. It showed the tower workshop at its center. It showed the paths that connected him to Giacomo, and Giacomo to his own teachers, extending backward into a past that Marco could imagine but never fully know. He worked slowly and deliberately, taking weeks to complete what he wanted to express. He used the precious pigments sparingly, saving them for moments of particular significance. He rendered the coastlines with perfect accuracy, but he also rendered something that existed beyond mere geography, the emotional landscape of his own life, the connections between people and work and time. When the chart was finally complete, Marco examined it without speaking for a very long time. It was not as technically complex as Giacomo's final masterwork, but it carried something that he wanted to preserve, a record of how knowledge had moved through generations, how the craft had survived and evolved, how people who would never meet in person had nonetheless shaped each other's understanding through the work they had created and the knowledge they had passed forward. He framed the chart carefully and placed it beside Giacomo's masterwork on the workshop wall. Two charts, separated by decades, but speaking to each other across that span of time, representing the continuity of the craft, the way each generation understood something new while maintaining the fundamental principles that had always defined the work. That night, Marco slept more peacefully than he had in many years. He dreamed of coastlines rendered in perfect lines, of ships guided safely by the accuracy of rendering, of apprentices and masters stretching backward and forward through time, all connected by the invisible threads of knowledge and care that bound the craft together. In the days that followed, Marco began to gradually release more of the daily work to Giovanni. He came to the workshop less frequently, spending more time simply sitting by the harbor, watching the ships and the water, understanding what Giacomo had tried to communicate about the peace that came when one had truly released responsibility. On a morning in early summer, Marco climbed the tower stairs one final time to the workshop he had inhabited for most of his adult life. The space seemed to welcome him, and seemed to hold all the work that had been accomplished there across decades. He stood for a long moment looking at the two charts on the wall, his own and Giacomo's, representatives of a lineage of knowledge and care. He left a letter for Giovanni, written in his careful script, explaining the principles that mattered most, the standards that must never be compromised, and the understanding that cartography was ultimately a form of love for the world and for the people who would use the charts that were created with such precision and care. Then he descended the stairs, knowing that he would not climb them again, understanding that the work was now fully in Giovanni's hands, that the craft had been passed forward to another generation, that the endless work of rendering the world with accuracy and beauty would continue long after Marco himself had moved into the peace that awaited beyond this life. In the harbor below, ships continued their eternal work of carrying people and goods across waters that had existed unchanged for millennia. The charts that guided them, rendered in the tower workshop by people whose names would mostly be forgotten, would carry forward the accumulated knowledge of countless cartographers, all of them now part of something larger than themselves. The work would continue, the knowledge would be preserved and evolved, the craft would endure. And in understanding this, Marco felt a deep, abiding peace settle into him like a tide, coming gently to shore the peace of knowing that his life had mattered, that his work had served purposes beyond himself, that he was part of a lineage that stretched backward into the past and would stretch forward into a future he would not see. The tower workshop stood silhouetted against the setting sun, its windows glowing with the last light of the day. Inside, the work tables waited quietly for morning, when Giovanni would return to continue the endless, sacred task of rendering the world with precision and care, guided by all those who had come before, working for all those who would come after. The coastlines had been rendered, the work was good, the knowledge would continue. And that was enough.